As a companion to our social emotional learning training suite, we developed a practical set of tools and templates and activities to be used with both staff and youth to increase intentional practices to support social emotional learning. So this video series is designed to provide a bit of an orientation to what you'll find in this freely available resource. The toolkit was designed for middle school learners in youth development contexts, but it can easily be modified to work well with different ages and audiences and contexts. So practitioners like you play an influential role in supporting the social emotional learning of the young people you work with. You model it, you design spaces and activities to support it, but it doesn't happen by accident. So there are things we can do to increase the chance, the likelihood that social emotional skills building can happen. And so we organize our trainings and toolkit around these 4 strategies. The first is about equipping staff, ourselves as the adults working with young people. Then we think about how social emotional learning can be caught. So how do we create the learning environment that will allow that to happen? And next, we think about how social emotional learning skills can be taught through intentional activities that are explicitly focused on a particular skill. And then finally, we think about how do we use data for improvement? How do we integrate reflection and measurement in a way that gives us more information about how we're doing related to social emotional learning skills? All right, so what I want you to do right now is just think about how are you feeling right now? Can you name an emotion for yourself, jot it down about how you're feeling? It doesn't really matter what that emotion is. It's really just about getting used to becoming aware of and naming emotions, right? And so I would ask you also to think about, what do you think is the average number of emotions that a person can identify? It's actually just 3, and I bet you know what they are, right? Happy, mad, and sad. And so when we ask, though, how many skills does somebody need to be able to name in order to be successful at working through them, it's much higher, 30, right? And so we know that the more accurately you can name an emotion, the quicker you can address it and work through it. So really that self-awareness of knowing our emotions and having a more nuanced understanding of what the variety of emotions might be is really an important skill. So one item in our toolkit is the emotion wheel. This really helps staff to be thinking about their own emotions and how they can think about that in a more, in a more nuanced way to really build your social and emotional learning vocabulary. Now I want to do just a little self-assessment. I'm going to read a statement, and I want you to consider where you would put yourself on this continuum on the screen here. So my feelings are clear to me at any given moment. Is that usually true for you, sometimes true, or rarely true? That your feelings are clear to you at any given moment? How about I can easily tell when I'm about to get angry? Where would you put yourself on that continuum? I find it easy to make goals and stick with them. Where might you place yourself? I can sense when a person's mood changes. Again, usually, sometimes, or rarely. And then the last question, I make friends easily. How true is that for you? So I just named some social emotional learning skills, right? We might call them things like emotional awareness or self-management, relational awareness, social management, right? But some of these things are skills we use so frequently, they come natural to us, right? We don't even have to think very consciously about them. And other skills are more difficult. And what we know is that all of these skills can be learned, right? We can get better at them. So a tool that we use to help people understand and think about social and emotional learning is this Ways of Being model, right? We developed this really as a teaching tool to help guide conversations about social emotional learning. So regardless of whatever framework you might be using in your setting or which particular skills you're focused on, you ought to be able to think about applying them with this ways of being model, right? It's skill neutral. And it's really designed to facilitate discussions so that we have a deeper understanding of what social emotional learning looks like in action. And so you'll see that the model is organized around how we are aware of and how we navigate across 3 different elements, right? How we think about our ways of feeling, our ways of relating, and our ways of doing. I'm going to walk us through the model a little more in depth, showing you some of the resources that are in the toolkit as well. So first, if you're having conversations with your staff team about, or others, young people, parents, about social emotional learning skills, I'd point you to these quick guides, right? So we have quick guides that help us understand and spark a conversation around social emotional learning in your program. Each guide provides like a short description about what that domain is about, with some examples of what some of those skills might be. And then we've got some discussion questions to guide staff, as well as some practices that you might be able to think about. How could we be better thinking about promoting this particular dimension of the model in our spaces? So again, as we think about now each of those dimensions, let's go a bit deeper. So at the heart of the model is Ways I Am. Every young person is a real person, a social emotional learner, and their identity shapes every aspect of how they approach social emotional learning. So for SEL skills to develop in young people, youth workers, teachers, right, we need to keep this core at the forefront of how we're thinking about one's learning process and how it's going to take hold. So the uniqueness of each young person, their sense of self is critical to acknowledge. So what I'd ask you is, in what ways do you allow the young people you work with to really express and share their identity, who they are? Where does that show up for you in your opportunities as you're working with young people? The next area is ways of feeling. So ways of feeling is actually often one of the more overlooked areas, as you know, we're not always thinking about our emotions and encouraging young people to identify their emotions. So again, really the importance of naming and labeling our emotions, how we're feeling in a given moment, helps us be able to regulate those as well, right? And how they might be impacting others. So again, think about for yourself in your classroom, in your program space, how do you encourage or discourage the expression of emotions, both of young people and of adults? What does that look like? And the next area is our ways of relating. So again, this is all of those skills that we need to understand and to navigate our interactions, our relationships with others. And while this is a key part of most of our settings where we're coming together with young people, it's important to really think about, how do young people get to know each other? Do we have ways in place for how we think about resolving conflict, right? How are we helping young people build these skills in the context where you're coming together? And then lastly, ways of doing. Ways of doing is all about forward momentum, right? It includes those big skill areas like problem solving, perseverance, goal setting. And then within this area of our model are all the smaller skills that we combine to really achieve our goals, right? So are there particular opportunities for young people that you work with for them to set goals, to make plans, to really follow through? How are those skills being practiced and reinforced? So beyond just the ways of being model, then we also want to think about, what does this look like within your program design, right? As you think about your program, how do social emotional learning skills have an opportunity to show up? So the example here on the slide would be a program where youth come together to design films, right? So we'd use the template that's in the toolkit to help you think through what goes in those yellow boxes for you. What are the pieces of your program? Whether it's over the course of a week, over a year, whatever the cycle looks like, what are the chunks? What would you name those? In this example, they're doing team building, they're doing some designing and planning, learning some technical skills, and then finally have a culminating event. That's their film festival. And then you go the next layer down, those more orange colored squares are our opportunities to think, okay, while they're doing team building, what is the social emotional skill that we could be really intentional about, right? So you might be thinking about teamwork or about self-awareness. And as you move through the different parts of your program, we'd ask that you would be thinking about how would we name what the social emotional skills are that could be intentionally supported at each of those phases of our program design, right? So that is a tool to help people really see where social emotional learning could be or is already showing up in your program. And what we know is, from the research, we know that just because youth programs are a great opportunity for young people to be developing these social emotional learning skills, it's not a given, right? In fact, there was a big meta-analysis, like a study of studies that found that, in some contexts, this wasn't happening, and in some cases it was. And what was different about those settings was that they had these 4 features that they use with the SAFE acronym. We added R to make it safer, and we'll talk about that. But when you think about what are the 4 practices then that were essential to help promote social and emotional learning, it was this. So it was sequenced. So it's a program where there's a planned set of activities that progressively challenges young people to build social emotional skills, right? They were active. So they were using active forms of learning where youth are leading discussions, they're contributing ideas, they're working together, they're taking on leadership roles. Next is focused, right? Are you really devoting a sufficient amount of time to the social emotional learning goals of your program? And then finally, are you explicit about them? So does your program target and name clearly what the SEL skills are? And then again, we added reflective. We know how important reflection is for learning to sort of stick. And so we added, how have you built in reflection so young people have the opportunity to process, to internalize those social emotional skills. So one of the items in the toolkit then is called the Safer Corners activity, and it's just an opportunity for staff to think through how their program is connected to these different components. How is it sequenced? How is it active? Have we been explicit? Are we focused? And do we use reflection? So thinking about how our program is safer is a great discussion point for staff to come together and really analyze what's happening. So by investing in a quality learning environment, youth programs are really well poised to effectively support social emotional skill development. This activity in the toolkit is really about exploring how the elements of program quality align with and support social emotional skill building. So the Weichert Center for Youth Program Quality developed this particular pyramid, this model for thinking about program quality, and it outlines these 4 domains of a quality learning environment with some key indicators then that correspond with each of those. So the point of this activity is to really consider how social emotional learning is supported in a supportive environment, right? With high levels of interaction and engagement. So starting with supportive environment, staff would share ways that your program does this well, right? Discuss which skills young people can learn and apply in a supportive environment, right? Are they doing things like critical thinking, communication, problem solving, emotion management? Then as you move up the pyramid to interaction, think about sharing ways that your program helps young people to learn and apply when interaction is present. So through things like teamwork, empathy, responsibility, and then finally looking at engagement. So what SEL skills can young people learn and apply when that is present, when engagement is present? Things like goal setting, decision-making, planning, reflection, perseverance. So again, another tool to help us think about it for our program design. How well are we aligned to program quality indicators, and how do we really think about the social emotional learning potential there? All right, the next activity is about mapping cultural values. So culture and identity are at the heart of the ways of being model, right? And relationships between cultural values and social emotional skills is complex. Cultural values will often determine which skills are most important to an individual, right? And so this activity is designed to help staff identify our own personal and cultural values and preferences that influence how we think about social emotional learning. So the toolkit item that you'll find actually has 10 different items, and I would just share the one on the slide as an example, right? So thinking about teamwork, some of you are more relationship focused, and by that I mean you value time spent on building relationships and work better with people when you get to know them. Others are more task focused, right? You prefer to focus on getting the job done and you become impatient with socializing. So think for yourself right now, where on this continuum would you place yourself? What feels more comfortable? Recognizing, of course, that context matters. Is it a work situation? How well do you know the people? All of those things matter. But if you had to put yourself somewhere, where would you generally say you land? And so for those who are more on the relationship-focused end of the continuum, I would have you think about what are the skills that are most important when you are working together on a team. What are the skills that really are going to help your team be successful? And typically when we do this in a training, people identify things like active listening, empathy, some of these key skills that really help us in our relationships. When we talk to those who are way further down on the task focus end of the continuum, and we say, okay, you've got a team that's really working, highly successful, what is it going to look like? What are the skills that you want your teammates to be bringing to that? And it's a whole different set of skills. It might include things like time management, organizational skills, right? And so what we learn by this example is recognizing that we value different skills, we bring different skills, and there's not one way to think about teamwork, right? It's thought about differently, and that's important. And it's important for us to be aware of our own values and also be aware of what other people, how they might be valuing or thinking about a particular skill. So again, these aren't fixed. Context does certainly play a role, but we do have our own kind of preferences as well that do influence that work. And my question would be, who gets to decide what success looks like in your program, right? So if we had a way of measuring teamwork, would we be privileging a particular way of valuing teamwork? Would we be having items that are more relationship focused or more task focused, right? And so thinking about within your program, who gets to decide what successful social emotional skills, what it looks like, how it's defined, how it's measured, those are highly relevant questions to explore. Because one question to ask ourselves is, are we weird? And by that I mean, are we Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic? So there's some research behind this concept, which would just underscore that there are some normative, dominant ways of thinking about some of these concepts, and it may be because we're privileging particular ways of knowing. These concepts have been understood in university settings, perhaps with samples of particular types of participants, and so we may be biased to thinking about them in a particular way. And so I want to just remind ourselves to be aware of that when we think about what assumptions we might be making about what a successful social emotional skill might look like for one person or another. Okay, next let's think about some of the frequently asked questions related to social emotional learning. The first one is, do I need to address all parts of the ways of being model? And I would say certainly not. Some programs are really keyed into one particular area or another. And what I would challenge people to think about is being thoughtful and intentional about what you're doing and why. And so knowing that your program is about relationships or your program is really focused on emotion regulation is key. And so being familiar with all the parts of the model and knowing what you're doing, what you're not doing, and why is essential. The next question is about, do all high-quality programs support social emotional learning? And here again, I think I would say not necessarily, right? I would say if your program does have those features, the ingredients of a high-quality program, it is well positioned to certainly be able to support social emotional skills. But if that is not the focus of your program, we would not expect social emotional skills to be the outcome. So we need to think intentionally about what we're doing and why we're doing it, how we're doing it, and whether we would expect to see changes in those particular skills. Next, how is social emotional learning linked to trauma and to mental health? And I would say that alongside social emotional learning, educators, we need training and we need support in other strategies as well, right? We need to be able to think about conflict de-escalation. We need to understand trauma and be able to do trauma-informed practice, as well as have an understanding of mental health and know what we should be looking out for and what resources we can turn to. Okay. All right. And last, how is social emotional learning linked to equity? Social emotional learning can't solve long-standing inequities, but it can be part of the puzzle. If your program is supporting social emotional learning, it may be able to be thinking about other things like how do we promote understanding of ourselves and of others? How are we examining our own biases? How are we recognizing the cultural assets that young people are bringing to our learning spaces? And how are we then creating more inclusive learning environments for everyone? I like this quote by Dina Simmons. She's with the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And she says, social emotional learning skills can help us build communities that foster courageous conversations across difference so that our students can confront injustice, hate, inequity. However, educators often teach SEL absent of the larger socio-political context, which is fraught with injustice and inequity and affects our students' lives. Educators shy away from such discussions for fear that they will be accused of politicization or that they'll lose their jobs, or they feel ill-equipped and uncomfortable addressing topics like poverty and gun violence, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and other forms of injustice that many students, particularly our most marginalized, experience daily. So this concludes our first video focused on equipping staff. I hope it's given you some ideas to think about how you and the staff you work with can think more intentionally about social emotional learning for yourselves and for the young people you work with. And know that there are other videos on the other 3 strategies as well, so I encourage you to check those out as well. Thank you.